Hey everyone, continuing along our lectures for the first project as we're getting into the expressive type album cover designs. I want to talk to you a little bit about process, design process, and then we'll get into some things to consider when working on creating expressive typography. Okay, so it's some things that you may overlook or not consider. Hopefully we'll look at some ideas here that might spur some ideas that can take into your explorations. Okay. The key thing here, I love this quote. It's basically saying, don't just focus. People get so bogged down about technical skills and like software knowledge and the tools essentially, and those are important things. But before we even start to worry about those, we have to think about seeing. Okay, learning to see, learning to think critically, developing ideas. It doesn't come out of a vacuum, and ideas don't come from, hey, here's the project I want you to do, and then I go run on the computer and start doing it. That rarely is effective. It's really about developing ideas through design process, getting down, writing word lists, sketching, getting all the ideas out of my head onto the paper. Now, this does not mean you have to be an incredible illustrator. You don't have to sketch beautiful, perfect sketches. Thumbnails and ideas are developed quickly, and they're meant to be quick, and they're meant to be fast. They don't have to be beautiful. They have to help you as a way to get you to the final result that you want to start to explore, okay? So it's not about a million typefaces and different software. It's about seeing, thinking, being able to hear, listen, be really clear on what the goal is. And remember, design follows from ideas. It's not the other way around. It does not, ideas don't, we can get ideas from design as a way of getting inspiration, but it's ultimately we have an idea, we have a need, and then we take that and work on it to create the design, right? So be observant, be aware. These are the crucial things, and I have to say, guys, it's sad, but we are such a Google image first page, culture now that we rarely spend hours, like we used to in the library, pulling out books and searching for things. And these days, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the digital sphere at all. It's a wonderful tool, but I think it's out of convenience. We can easily get lazy and not explore ideas at a level that we should. So design process can help us actually do that, okay? I'm going to show you a couple diagrams here that I found extremely useful when considering the process. And they're essentially saying the same thing. They're just different ways of considering the process. I think of design process as a very linear process. There's a starting point. I have my initial idea. I get a meeting with the client. I get a brief. I look this over. I start to get into research mode. I start to think about what is it we're trying to say? What's the problem here? What is it that we got to do, essentially? I start to get a pencil or pen out. I fill up pages with words and key, terms. I start to sketch. And then, so before I even touch a pencil to sketch with or pen, I'm working on the ideas, the front end, figuring out what the goals are, what the needs are. Then I start to develop my thumbnails, and I get into this second stage of preliminary visual ideas. And then I have out of 50 sketches or more, I will then whittle them down to the versions that I think maybe work the best. Now I might have a lot of sketches that are garbage, ideas that are stupid, and that's okay. These are just things to just get on the page. Sometimes I just got to get them out of my head and onto the page, even if they're kind of dumb. Give yourself permission to do that. Don't let your editor be sitting on your shoulder screaming into your ear, that sucks. That's not useful. Just flick them off your shoulder and do what you got to do. Screw them, right? It's not about ego. It's not about overly editing ourselves. It's about really getting to the best idea, regardless of whatever hurdles we might put in our own way. So sometimes just sitting down, rolling up our sleeves, and doing the stuff is the best solution, okay? But doing it is not just jumping in and going to town. Like I said, it's doing it in a way that's somewhat methodical. So identifying what it is the goals are, starting to develop the visuals, sort and sort of refine the ideas to take them into a next stage where you start to figure out, okay, what's the best ones that, what are the best 3 or 5 I can start to work with. I analyze all the options. I start to refine them. I create what are called comps, and typically that would be the first thing you show to a client, or your comps, along with any other research. And you might show them 3 ideas for something, okay? And then, you take that, and based on revisions, you'll take, whatever feedback's given, make any refinements you have to make, and go back and get another round of revisions, or whatever it is, depending on how many revisions you're allowing your client to have per your agreement. And then you eventually get to this print phase or digital phase, depending on what the media is. Okay, but it's a very linear process. This one is, it's the same thing essentially, but simpler. And I would say that this is the visual. When I say design process, I still get this visual in my brain. This has been burned onto my brain here in a way that is permanent. So when I say design process, I think of this visual. Okay, it's just preliminary, and I'm not even talking about just, getting the research down. This is just purely the visual development. I, do my raw thumbnails, a lot of sketches, guys. This is one thing that I also find people are lazy when it comes to sketching. Don't be. Do as many things as you can, okay? Not just to do them, but just to really dig. And sometimes a project happens where you actually get an idea sooner, and within an hour or so you have a strong idea, and then you can take that and start to work with it, and that does happen. But oftentimes you got to dig deeper than that, okay? So you take your thumbnails, you refine them down, you start to develop what are called roughs. And so from 50 ideas, I might take it down to 10, and then from 10, I might take it down to 5, and then from 5, I might whittle it down to 3. I'll show a few comps, make the decisions with the client, and then we're on the way, okay, to finished. So same thing applies for your school projects. Same process here, just some people maybe prefer to see something in a more cyclical fashion versus a purely linear fashion. Okay, this is the same thing. You identify the issues, you do the preliminary explorations, you make refinements, you take it down to decide, what are the comps, you make any sort of final changes and revisions, and then you implement them, okay? And if it's a multi-phase project, it helps, because you're going to apply that process in a way that is circular. Okay, what are we looking at here? Here's a conversation I typically like to have in class where, I'll ask you, what do you think of when you look at this image? And if you just took a second and looked at this and thought, what am I getting out of this? Inevitably, I hear people say it's calming, and then I hear other people say it's kind of foreboding and dark. And other people are saying it looks so like I just want to jump into that glassy water. And other people say it looks freezing and cold. And so is this a positive image? Is it a dark image? Is it too open to interpretation? Okay. Sometimes that is a good thing. We want the viewer to have to sort of figure it out. But again, that depends on context. Is it the appropriate context? If I'm sitting in a museum and I'm looking at a piece, I want to maybe have a little bit of need to interact with it and kind of figure it out. In a project like a record cover, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, if we're walking through a store, we want to be able to be drawn to something really quickly and know what it is we're looking at, And so, don't leave things too open to interpretation. Be really clear. Okay, this is one of my favorite photos. This is on my wall. I've had it since I was a kid. Muhammad Ali is one of my heroes, and I don't know. This is just definitive. This is impactful. This is everything. It's just that's one thing. This is another thing. Okay, clear, impactful. That's what we're going for. So in this process, I was talking about word lists and things. I do this, like I'll just write, and I'll just do pages of things like this, okay? And then I'll do mind maps, okay, where you'll have a central element here, and then you'll start to break it and branch it off into other items, and then you'll do subsections of those as well, okay? So I'll do this on the front end of things before I even do anything visual. And then I'll start to sketch, okay? And these are just thumbnails that I'll do, and I'm always writing notes in the margins to myself as to why I'm doing what I'm doing and things to be aware of, structural things like grids, etc. I'll start to work on developing. Now, your projects are essentially black and white in one color, so you're not doing an extensive color study, but at the same time, that's a consideration. So even if it's a more minimal palette, I'll start to think about color. Even if a project doesn't incorporate imagery, I'll start to maybe look at images to get a feel, to get a vibe, okay? So I'll create these sort of specific mood boards. Okay, you guys are creating a mood board, but it's going to be more inclusive of other elements as well. I might pick, images and elements for look and feel. This is for a craft distillery that was based on a Prohibition-era rum runner, which is this boat here. And so this was kind of one of the initial visual studies. Then you get into sketches for the symbol. Now it's like a boat, a schooner looks like a, I don't know if it was this, I can't remember, the rum runner. This is a rum runner. I don't know what kind of boat it is. But it's very easy to make, they can all look the same. So you have to figure out stylistically what you want to do. So you're going through and sketching, and then, these are only 2 pages of many. And then you'll start to do digital renderings of those things. And you'll start to stylize them and putting them into shapes and spyglasses in this situation. Stylistically, you'll have textural differences, all these kinds of things, until you start to get a sense of, the finals. You'll do type studies, really raw, just quick mock-ups, and then you'll eventually get to a point where they're on the boxes and they're being shipped, right? So that's kind of the design process in a nutshell, okay? I'm trying to move quickly here. One thing that's for sure is, one of the only things that you'll find in design projects is that they each have their own unique thing. Now, they're going to, a logo job is not a logo job. It's not going to be the same across every client, okay? So it really depends on so many factors. What is the business? Who are the people you're dealing with? What's the purpose? Is it a service? Is it a product? Is it a packaging thing as well? Is it something that's tangible? Is it intangible? Is it purely digital? All these things have an impact on even just something like a logo design. So there are many differences, but you can still approach all of them with this clear structural design process. Okay, that's the best way to approach any design problem you have. Okay, so going beyond that, if you have any questions about process, please let me know, because it's a huge factor, and it's something that I'm a stickler for your own benefit as students. Now, once I start to get past that initial stage, and I start to look for expressive type, and I start to look at type ideas, I'm gonna I've figured out kind of my direction. I've done all my front end work. Now I start to just do some searches. Now, a simple Google search will yield things like this for expressive type. Okay, not bad, right? Just very basic type, and it's just the idea of slicing it off and sending it on its way as the bird in flight it's effective, right? I mean, it's a standard example, but it works. This is interesting. This is another one. This is another just simple Google search, but this is a smart combination of typefaces where you're taking this heavier sans with this lighter serif typeface and then using the black and white in a way that conveys an idea here. And again, nothing overly conceptual, but it's directly representational and expressive of an idea. So it's more just to show you how sometimes combining typefaces in odd ways can yield some interesting ideas. First thing you do, especially like when you have your album title for your project, is to write it out, because you want to start to see what are the characters that I have to deal with, and are there any ideas just in the characters themselves. So in this example of elevator, the V and the A, they happen to be right next to each other conveniently for us. You can take out the cross bar of the A and just create that idea of the up-down. Okay, again, not earth-shattering, but this is just really meant to show you that, hey, sometimes the ideas live in the characters themselves, depending on what characters are in the word or words. Okay. Modifying type. This is tricky sometimes, especially when you're dealing with curves. You got to do it in a very careful way, but there are some basic things you can do, and some of you did really nice jobs with this on your expressive type projects. You started to modify things and cut them up and combine them. So this is just another example of that. The other thing type can do is be used as an element. You can take pieces of type. You can take letters and combine them. You can repeat them. You can create pattern and texture purely from typographic elements. This is, the dot of an I. This is also, depending on the typeface, a dot of an I. This is also a sliced little part of the lowercase l on a sans serif, typeface. You have a lot of room for interpretation when it comes to how you use your type elements. Okay, they can create value, and create a sense of gradation. I'd say be careful, to overuse repetition just to create just for texture. With full words at least, because then we want to start to read them and kind of figure them out. Now, if that's part of the idea, that's great. This is mainly meant to show you that through repetition and different weights and then kind of placement, you can create some interesting visual elements here. And with simply 2 weights here, you start to get a pattern happening, for example. Okay. Now, you guys are dealing with titles. You're dealing with fewer, you're dealing with less content. So something like this may not work as well, but it's meant to show you. It's meant to show you some possible ideas. Okay. Another example of one typeface, different ways to create this sense of kind of a this gradient effect here. There's the darker values to the lighter values using the different weights. Same thing, just a combination of weights. One typeface in the regular weight and in the italic weight. Alternated to create a sense of movement. Sometimes, just combining weights and combining different sizes can create interesting effects. Okay, so that could be something that's, a useful idea depending on what your title is and who your artist is. Finding a typeface that has extensive weight options is sometimes useful. This is the typeface universe. It has a whole system of options from the darkest, heaviest weight that is slightly extended to the thinnest condensed weight and everything in between. Okay, so you can see even within one typeface a lot of possibilities. Again, I don't speak the language, but I know this has something to do with swimming. I granted that this helps, but also the movement and the flowiness and the wateriness of it says what it needs to say. And this is really just one typeface, one size and one weight, and it's just shifted to create an idea, something to think about. Scale and texture can be your friends. Really bold, larger type can have a dramatic visual impact. Bleeds are also your friend, and I would say that bleeds are something I would consider using for the title. I typically require that in project 1, but for our purposes here, we'll have the option, but it doesn't have to be a requirement. Now, texture is a tricky thing. Don't use totally raw, filter-driven textures or something within the software itself. It's better when you can incorporate texture from more organic means. There are you could go online and find free vector textures or free Photoshop textures. And they can work. Now, the idea is, hey, we're not supposed to add visual things. We're not supposed to add illustrations and add photos and we're supposed to just use type only. That is true. I would say that you could argue that the texture in this case is basically a subtraction from the type. So you can look at the texture as taking away from the type, and that is fine to do. Just some more examples of texture. I mean, even just one typeface, how you can repeat it and bunch it up, and you create a sense of swirling movement or bugs or ants or something, even just with the letter K. It almost has a sense of like chaos and movement, and a sense of kind of projecting from that center there, or being sucked into it, depending on what the idea is. Okay. Again, one typeface, one size, and the same weight, and this is just through repetition and overlap to create this idea of inflammation. You get an inflamed, vibe here. Color is part of it, for sure. But definitely, it's just the typeface itself expressing an idea. Now you can like we were talking about with texture, you can scrape the type, you can crease it, you can do these digitally. You can also print them and do them manually. I think that's often really cool because it's unpredictable. The results can be unpredictable, which leads to maybe sometimes a more dynamic solution. And it's just fun to get your hands on things. Okay, you can peel the type. You can if you do this kind of things, you have to do it judiciously. Like you can't just take a pumpkin bloat filter or whatever, a warp filter, and just start to go to town. We don't want to do that. We don't want the effects. We don't want the idea to necessarily be dependent on effects. Okay, they can be a tool, but we don't want to have it be all about the effects. You might find examples where that's, maybe the effects are too much of the idea. We'll have to take it case by case. But again, you can splinter the type, cut it up, do whatever you want. Talking about doing it manually, I mean, here's just Franklin Gothic and a heavy weight, the demi weight here. And it's set on a page, not doing anything, not being expressive. So this says expressive typography. But if I print it out, and this isn't necessarily, I'm not working an idea here for you. I'm just working, this is just purely a technique for you to consider. I take this, I crumple it up, print it out, I crumple it up, I take a picture of it, take it into Photoshop, totally punch up the contrast, and there you go. You get this almost a more organically treated expressive type that started from here. It looked like that when it was printed. It was crumpled up, photographed, scanned, and I mean, this is something that was done a lot in the '60s. This sort of organic approach, and you can say, hey, I can just do that on my, with some filter now, or some software, tweak. Maybe you can, but there's something that's just raw about this and organic, and still, the proportions are still actually technically, I didn't alter them and destroy the proportions. All I did was crumple up the paper. You know what I mean? There's something a little more pure about that, which is important. And then it looks like that in reverse, kind of interesting. If I take that same piece of paper and start to take some scissors to it, scan, put that into Photoshop, you can see that effect. You can see it when it's reversed, okay? So again, I mean, just some things to ideas to consider. That's all this is here. You can see these examples here, these Franz Kafka book covers are doing very much what we just looked at, all those different examples here, to convey the idea of change for this title of the Metamorphosis, okay? A few different versions of it here. I'm curious which one you think works best, if any. Here's a logo. This was for the Solidarity movement. This was active in Poland in the 1980s, and this was a hand-rendered logo. And this is the word solidarity, okay, in that language, with this small flag coming off the stem of this N here, okay, and a sense of people with the dots, and again, a really raw, very organic solution, but conveying the idea of together, banded together for a cause, okay? And it's clear with a very simple type solution. Now you could say, well, this flag isn't type. Well, you can make it out of type very easily. And you can hand render your options here, guys. So that's something to consider too. I want you to use some type. So if you hand render your main title, then the artist name might be in a set typeface, okay? Wildflower breads, okay? This is a logo now that we're looking at. Handmade artisan breads. This is really, again, that idea of subtracting pieces of the type away to convey this texture. And in here, the texture is all about flour. What does it look like on a cutting board, or when you knead dough and you have to throw out the flour? It's kind of meant to convey that idea of rustic and raw and custom made or well crafted. And through texture and through omitting pieces of type, we convey an idea that that helps elevate the logo in this situation. Okay, this is Club Dada. If any of you have had design history, you might know of the Dada movement, which was in the early 1900s. Started as a sort of protest art movement that just was against the absurdities of the First World War. So a lot of nonsense poetry and art. They started to shake things up and really push buttons. And this is, I could look at this and think this is from, the 80s or 90s, and this is from 1919, this layout, okay? So all they're doing here is combining in different typefaces using different scales and placing them in really odd ways to convey, in this case, this was all about how they were identifying themselves. Here's a flyer, a Dadaist flyer from an era around the same time. This is 1923, and it could look like a flyer from not that long ago. These overlaps in these two colors. Now your album cover is basically black and white with an accent color. This could fly for that, even though red is pretty dominant here. I'd say that this is a fair treatment to consider. But these overlap of the black on red creates a sense of depth and dimension. And this is for a party. This is just, it's loud, it's in your face, it's almost nonsensical, and it's raw. And you can see later movements really pulled, from that aesthetic. I mean, this is again another punk rock flyer from the 80s, and not a million miles from the Dadaist approach. I mean, there's something about that those old art movements and design movements still inform what we're doing today. Okay, here's a Rolling Stone in the 80s in particular, 70s and 80s, maybe even into the 90s, was very well known for its editorial design through a woman named Fred Woodward and Gail Anderson worked together. And here's something, I want to say, be careful with illustrating, being overly illustrative with your type. But in this case, the Bats Meow for this Michelle Pfeiffer interview or article, it works. It's purely typographic. It's just combining type elements, and it says what it needs to say for this particular context, okay? For yours, I would say try not to necessarily draw pictures with type, but maybe it works for certain situations, okay? So we'll take it case by case. This is just meant to make you think, like, sometimes you can stack it like this and put it on its side and get it tight and bold and up close to each other and textural if it works for your idea. Again, a little more hand rendered. This for DMX here. This hand rendered and kind of depth that's given with almost this pen and ink feel. That's something to consider for your approach. This Alicia Keys article here using quintessential New York artist. If you've been to New York, you know about the subways. Subway tiles are an aesthetic, and you see a lot of the these compositions that are made with type or image throughout the subways, and they're usually done with these tiles. So the next Queen of Soul, done in this style, works perfectly for this artist. Okay. So again, you're always asking yourself, what's the context? Who is this artist? What is she? She's quintessentially New York. She's got this whole vibe. And so then I think about, well, now I put myself in New York. Where does type live? It lives everywhere in New York. It's on ads. It's on the street corners. It's on the ground. It's on a poster. It's on the subway walls. And that's just one option that comes out of it. Sometimes it's looked down. Sometimes it's in your food. Okay, hopefully you're not eating a lot of alphabet soup, but if you are, it lives there too. Objects. Like this is an old stamp where you have self-inking stamp, where you would actually take these tweezers and set the type in this way, and then ink it and print out a little, stamped message. This is again another editorial spread where the type is actually made on that object and photographed. Now we can't photograph for our projects, but again, an idea that can maybe spark another idea. Type sometimes is made of objects and natural elements. Is that something you can do? Sure, you can do that. I mean, you can take it, digitize it, and work with it in a way, So primarily the idea here is just to make you think about other possibilities besides the computer. Type lives out there in many different ways. How can you use found elements to create type? It works perfectly for this Johnny Cash article, The Legend of Country Music, this rustic sort of stick typography. Some sort of fashion editorial spread here. Really, it's just scale and placement, okay? Create that idea of a dynamic movement. Sometimes ideas live in the glyphs and the punctuation symbols. and then scaling them up huge. Maybe there's an idea there somewhere. Okay, so think about your entire typeface, not just the letters or the numerals, but sometimes the symbols might give you some possibilities as well. In this case, when it's about the CBS News, it's all about quotes and news sources, etc. Worth repeating, it says. Sometimes it's about combining, like I said earlier, taking space out, getting things really tight, combining elements and making them work together in a new way that is almost structural or sculptural, something to consider as well. Sometimes it's the opposite, and you're actually spacing things out and taking pieces away. This is for the minimalist composer Eric Satie. So this whole aesthetic is breadth and openness and space that connects directly to the artist's music. Okay. So how can I say the most here with the least amount of elements to convey this idea? Sometimes that's a good thing to ask yourself. How can I say the most with the least? This is not legal for your project because it's more almost photographed. But if this idea of this love and hate sort of being interchanged here, this whole idea of love will tear us apart. This is essentially just setting type and slicing it and shifting it a little bit off, so it's offset, and there's an idea living in there. Okay, so sometimes ideas are simple, but if they're smart, that works. And sometimes type, like I said, isn't even type. Sometimes it's objects. And so are you going to maybe work with objects, and are you going to consider working with objects and bringing them in somehow into this sphere, whether it's a scan and then a tracing digitally or something? I'll work with you on that. If you have an idea that's strong enough, show me your idea and I'll be open, okay? So just a bunch of ideas. I want you to think about design process, and I want you to think creatively about what your options are. Even though the constraints seem significant in this project, the possibilities are endless, guys, okay? Thanks for listening. Any questions, like I said, always get a hold of me, and we'll see you in the next lecture.